In 1633, the Sultan of the Ottoman Empire was said to walk the streets of his own capital at night, in disguise, carrying a sword almost as tall as a man. His name was Murad IV, and he was hunting not rebels, not assassins. He was hunting people drinking coffee. By some later accounts, when Murad found a man sipping from a small cup in a back alley or a quiet shop, he drew that heavy two-handed blade and beheaded him on the spot. No trial, no warning. What is solid is that under Murad, coffeehouses were closed in Istanbul, coffee was suppressed, and punishment could be brutal. Think about that. A hot drink you can buy on any corner today for $2. A drink the world now pours more than 2 billion cups of every single day. And there was a point in history where the most powerful man in one of the largest empires on earth considered it dangerous enough to suppress with force. So how did a roasted seed become something a sultan would crack down so hard to stop? How did the same drink go on to topple kings, build the modern stock market, and chain hundreds of thousands of human beings to plantations across 2 continents? The answer is that coffee was never really just a drink, it was a drug. And it arrived in a world that was, more or less, used to living on alcohol. The story starts thousands of miles from Istanbul, in the highlands of Ethiopia, with a legend almost everyone has heard. A goat herder named Kaldi noticed his goats acting strange after eating the red berries off a certain shrub. They were jumping, full of energy, refusing to sleep. Kaldi tried the berries himself, felt the same jolt, and the discovery of coffee was born. It is a great story. It is also almost certainly not true. That tale doesn't show up anywhere in writing until the late 1600s, centuries after the fact, and the name Kaldi seems to have been added even later. So set the goats aside. The real history of coffee as a drink begins across the Red Sea in Yemen in the 1400s, and it begins not with farmers or merchants, but with mystics. Sufi Muslims in Yemen were drinking coffee for a very specific reason. They needed to stay awake. Their religious practice involved long nighttime devotions, hours of rhythmic prayer and chanting, repeating the name of God deep into the darkness. Staying alert through all of that was hard. Coffee made it possible. The first job coffee ever had was to keep worshippers awake so they could reach closer to God. And almost immediately, you can see the thing that would define coffee for the next 500 years. This was a substance that did something to the human mind. It pushed back sleep, it sharpened attention, it made people feel clear. For the Sufis, that was a gift. To the people who held power, it would soon look like a threat. Coffee spread out from Yemen along the trade routes, and for a long time, one port controlled almost all of it. Mocha on the Yemeni coast. That single town was the gateway through which the entire world's coffee flowed. The name still sits on your cafe menu today, but a drink that keeps people awake and sharp doesn't stay quiet for long. And the first time coffee really collided with authority, the authority panicked. The year was 1511. The place was Mecca, the holiest city in Islam. A local official named Khair Beg was walking near the great mosque one night when he saw a group of men drinking coffee in the lamplight. There was something about it that unsettled him. They were awake when they should have been tired. They were talking, gathered, alert, energized in a way he couldn't control. He decided this was dangerous, and he banned it. That was the first recorded war on coffee. It would not be the last. Because by now, coffee had stopped being just a drink you had at home. It had created something entirely new, a place, the coffeehouse. In Arabic, the kahve khane, they opened across Cairo, Damascus, and Istanbul, and they were unlike anything that had existed before. They weren't taverns because no one was getting drunk. People came to these rooms sober, stayed sharp, and did something with that sharpness. They talked, they argued, they played games, recited poetry, debated religion, and traded news. They talked about politics. They talked about the people in charge. And that is exactly what got Murad IV so worried. Murad knew his coffeehouses. He knew that the unemployed soldiers of his own army, the Janissaries, spent their days in them. And he knew that some of those rooms full of caffeinated, idle, talking men were where plots against him took shape. Coups were being whispered over coffee cups. So when he banned the drink and shut the coffeehouses, and by some accounts started swinging that sword, he wasn't really afraid of the bean. He was afraid of what the bean did to people. It woke them up, it gathered them together, it got them talking. And there is almost nothing a ruler finds more threatening than a room full of wide-awake people comparing notes. Here is the pattern, and hold on to it, because you are going to watch it repeat. Coffee makes people alert, social, and talkative, and over, the powerful decide that has to be stopped. Now picture this drink crossing into Europe, because Europe, at this exact moment, was not ready for what coffee was about to do to it. To understand why coffee hit Europe like a bomb, you have to understand what many Europeans were drinking before it. The answer is alcohol, often daily, often from morning onward. This was not because Europe was a continent of drunks for fun. It was habit, diet, and sometimes survival. In many towns and cities, the water could be filthy, contaminated, and a reliable way to get sick or die. Weak beer and watered wine were often safer, or at least more trusted, because the brewing process made them cleaner than what came out of the well. So people drank ale with breakfast. They drank through the working day. Children drank it. Many medieval and early modern Europeans spent large parts of the day under a light, constant haze of alcohol, a depressant, something that dulls the mind and slows the body. That is the world coffee walked into, a world running on a sedative. And then, suddenly, here was a drink that did the opposite of everything alcohol did. It didn't dull you, it lit you up. It didn't slow your thoughts, it accelerated them. Coffee was a stimulant landing in a world long accustomed to low alcohol daily drinking. For the first time, large numbers of people could spend more of the day awake, focused, and clear instead of softly buzzed. And the way the drug pulls that off is almost sneaky. The longer you stay awake, a chemical called adenosine builds up in your brain, and it's the thing that slowly makes you feel tired. Caffeine fits into the very slots in your brain that adenosine is meant to use and jams them. The sleep signal is still being sent. Your brain just can't hear it anymore. So you don't really get free energy out of a cup of coffee. You borrow it against rest you'll have to pay back later. And an entire civilization was about to start living on that loan. That switch from a depressant to a stimulant as a default drink of daily life is one of the most underrated turning points in human history. You don't get the modern world out of a commercial culture that's gently drunk by noon. You get it out of one that's caffeinated and paying attention. Coffee reached Europe through trade with the Ottoman world, flowing into ports like Venice in the early 1600s, and it ran straight into suspicion. This was a Muslim drink, dark and strange, coming from the lands of Islam. Some Christian voices called it the bitter invention of Satan and wanted it banned before it could corrupt the faithful. According to the story, the matter went all the way to the Pope. Clement VIII was urged to condemn coffee as the devil's drink, but before he ruled on it, he asked to taste it first. And the legend says that after a sip or two, the Pope enjoyed it so much that he decided the devil should not get to keep it. He would baptize it instead and make it Christian. Whether every word of that is true is debated. But the outcome is not. Coffee won. Europe started drinking. And what happened next is the part the whole story has been building toward. In England, coffeehouses exploded. The first opened in the 1650s, and within a few decades, London had hundreds of them. And they earned a nickname that tells you everything. People called them penny universities. The idea was simple and revolutionary. For the price of 1 penny, the cost of a single cup of coffee, you could walk in, sit down, and join the best conversation in the city. You didn't need a title, you didn't need a fortune. A merchant, a poet, a scientist, and a sailor could all sit at the same table, sober and sharp, and trade ideas. An education for a penny, nothing like it had existed in a society built on rigid class lines. Some coffee houses even posted rules on the wall spelling it out. Leave your rank at the door, and no man takes a better seat than the one who got there first. And the things that came out of those rooms reshaped the world. There was a coffee house run by a man named Edward Lloyd near the London docks. Ship captains, merchants, and the people who put up money to insure voyages gathered there to swap information about which ships had sailed and which had sunk. Out of all that talk over coffee grew a business of insuring those ships against disaster. That coffee house became Lloyd's of London, which is still one of the most important insurance markets on the planet. At another coffee house called Jonathan's, traders and merchants gathered to buy and sell shares in companies. They had no formal building and no official rules. They just met over coffee and dealt. That gathering became the London Stock Exchange, one of the foundations of the entire modern financial system. And at a coffee house called the Grecian, the scientists of the Royal Society argued out the new ideas of the age. Isaac Newton's circle was part of that world. The early arguments of modern science were hammered out in rooms thick with coffee steam. Step back and look at what that means. Insurance, the stock market, modern science, and the swirl of debate we now call the Enlightenment. All of it bubbling up out of caffeinated rooms full of people who, a century earlier, would have been 3 ales deep by lunchtime. The drug didn't just keep people awake. It built the institutions of the modern economy, but a public this awake and this loud does not go unnoticed for long, and the king had been watching. In 1675, King Charles II had had enough. These coffee houses, in his view, were nests of gossip and sedition, places where ordinary men sat around criticizing the crown. So he issued a proclamation to shut them all down. And then something remarkable happened. The backlash was so immediate and so furious that the king folded almost at once. Within days, the ban was dead. The coffee houses stayed open. That is the moment the pattern breaks. From Mecca to Murad's crackdown, power had always been able to crush coffee by force. But by 1675, in England, the coffee-drinking public had become too large, too connected, and too important to silence. The drink had won. The people who ran on it were now stronger than the man trying to stop them, and that political fire did not stay in London. It crossed the Atlantic. In 1773, American colonists, furious over British taxes, dumped an entire shipment of British tea into Boston Harbor. After that night, drinking tea in the colonies started to look like loyalty to the very empire people were trying to break away from, and coffee became the patriotic alternative. John Adams, a future president who freely admitted he actually preferred tea, gave it up and switched to coffee on principle. A new nation was choosing its drink, and it chose the stimulant of rebellion over the brew of the crown. But all of this depended on one thing nobody in Europe had figured out yet: where the coffee actually came from, and how to control it. Because for all their coffee houses, the Europeans didn't grow a single bean. Every cup still traced back to the Arab world, and the Arab world had no intention of giving up that monopoly. Breaking it would take theft, smuggling, and a level of obsession that, looking back, is genuinely hard to believe. Picture one of the stories told about how Europe broke the monopoly. A French naval officer named Gabriel de Clue, somewhere in the early 1700s, on a ship crossing the Atlantic toward the Caribbean. The voyage is going badly. Water is running low, and it gets rationed out, a little to each man, and de Clue takes part of his own ration, the water he needs to survive, and he pours it onto a single small coffee plant he is carrying in a glass case. Day after day, he keeps that seedling alive by going thirsty himself. That one plant, in the story, and a handful of others smuggled to the Americas, would seed entire empires of coffee. That is how badly Europe wanted control of this drug. Men were willing to risk everything for a cutting in a box. They had to go to those lengths because the Arab world guarded its monopoly fiercely. Arab merchants tried to stop fertile beans and living plants from leaving Yemen so that no one could take them abroad and plant trees of their own. For a long time, it worked. The first crack in it came, legend says, from a man named Baba Budan, a Muslim pilgrim who, on his way home from Mecca in the 1600s, taped 7 living coffee seeds against his body and walked them out of Arabia. He was said to have done it anyway and planted them in the hills of southern India. Then the Dutch, ruthless and organized, got hold of living coffee plants and did what the Arabs had feared most. They started growing it themselves, in their colonies in Ceylon and on the island of Java, on a massive scale. The monopoly shattered, and once Europeans could grow coffee in their own tropical colonies, the entire nature of the trade changed. It stopped being about buying a luxury from distant merchants. It became about growing it in enormous quantities as cheaply as possible, and the cheapest way to produce it was with people who weren't paid at all. This is where the story turns dark, and where coffee's real price comes into focus. The French took that single line of smuggled plants and built a coffee colony in the Caribbean on the western half of the island of Hispaniola, a place they called Saint-Domingue. The land and climate were perfect, the profits were staggering, and the entire system ran on enslaved Africans. By 1788, this one French colony was producing roughly half of all the coffee in the world. Half. The whole of Europe sipping its sophisticated civilized brew in its elegant coffeehouses, and half of what was in those cups came from a single island worked by people held in bondage and dying under some of the most brutal plantation conditions anywhere on Earth. Now hold those two images in your head at the same time, because this is the heart of the whole story. In Paris, the coffeehouses were doing in France what they had done in England. They were filling up with writers, thinkers, and angry young men who sat for hours, sharp and sober and furious, talking about liberty and rights and the rot of the monarchy. And in July of 1789, in one of those very cafes, a young journalist named Camille Desmoulins jumped up onto a table outside the Café de Foy and delivered a passionate speech to the crowd, calling the people to arms. 2 days later, the people stormed the Bastille, and the French Revolution had begun. So here is the paradox at the center of coffee. The exact same drink, the exact same drug, was fueling the dream of human freedom in the cafes of Paris and fueling human slavery on the plantations of Saint-Domingue at the very same moment. The liberty was real, the bondage was real, and they were two ends of the same supply chain. The enslaved people of Saint-Domingue did not miss the irony. The same revolutionary ideas of freedom that coffee was helping spread in France reached the plantations too. In 1791, the enslaved population of Saint-Domingue rose up in one of the largest and most successful slave revolts in history and went on to win their independence and found the nation of Haiti. Coffee helped light the fire of revolution at both ends of its own trade. And the demand never slowed. After Saint-Domingue, the center of the coffee world shifted to a place that would dominate it like nowhere else: Brazil. In the first half of the 1800s, Brazil's exploding coffee frontier became a major driver of slave imports, internal slave transfers, and plantation growth. By 1850, Brazil alone was producing about half the coffee on the planet, an empire of beans built, once again, on forced labor. The drug that woke up the modern mind was, at the same time, one of the great engines of the Atlantic slave trade. And when Brazil finally abolished slavery in 1888, the last country in the Americas to do it, the coffee barons simply turned to waves of poor European immigrants, many of them Italian, to keep the harvest moving and the cups full. And when slavery finally ended, coffee simply found a new kind of worker to power all of us. Because by the 1800s, the world was changing shape again, and coffee was right at the center of it. The Industrial Revolution was pulling people off farms and into factories and cities, and factory work demanded something the old farming rhythm never had: long hours of alert, precise, repetitive attention, often deep into the night under artificial light. You cannot run a dangerous machine for 12 hours while gently drunk on ale, but you can run it on coffee. So the same switch that had transformed Europe centuries earlier now played out on the factory floor. Workers traded the morning beer for the morning coffee. Caffeine kept them awake on the night shift, alert at the controls, and productive past the point where the body wants to quit. Coffee became the quiet fuel of industrial labor, the thing that made the long, modern workday physically possible. That is the role it has never given up. Coffee stopped being the drink that built empires and became the drink that runs our daily lives. Today, caffeine is the most widely used psychoactive drug on the entire planet. Not alcohol, not nicotine, caffeine. More than 2 billion cups of coffee are consumed every single day, and around 25 million farming families depend on growing it to survive. And the story still points back to the same highlands where the whole thing started, the mountains of Ethiopia and Yemen, historically central to coffee's origin story, where Sufi mystics first brewed it to stay awake for God. So think about Murad IV one more time, in the stories told about him walking his streets with that enormous sword, ready to make an example of a man for the crime of drinking a cup of coffee. He looks insane to us now, but in a strange way he understood something the rest of us forgot. He saw that this drink did something to people, that it woke them up, gathered them together, made them talk, made them think, made them dangerous. He was wrong to try to kill it, but he wasn't wrong about its power. The empires that fought over coffee are gone. The kings who tried to ban it are dust. The old plantation regime ended, but the system never became innocent. Millions of growers still remain at the vulnerable end of the chain, doing the work while more of the value is captured somewhere else. And the drug outlasted all of them. And it is still doing exactly what it always did. It is still waking the world up, one cup at a time. If you made it this far, I'd love to know which part caught you off guard, so drop it in the comments. And if stories like this are your thing, subscribe, because the hidden forces behind history are stranger than almost anyone realizes. There is, after all, a decent chance you are drinking the proof right now,